Yes, so hello and welcome everyone to this virtual book launch of Green Academia by and with Sayan Day. My name is Christiane Kliemann and I'm doing communications for EADI, the European Association of Development Research and Training Institutes, which is the leading European network for development studies. We've got more than 100 institutional members all over Europe, and we organize activities and provide platforms for international networking and exchange with a strong interdisciplinary focus. And we also aim at extending the reach of development studies and critical social scholarship. And before we start, just let me say a few words about today's format. So the event will be recorded and later on published on our YouTube channel, but only the speakers will be visible there. So if you want to ask questions and don't want to be on the video, you can post them always in the chat so I can ask them for you. If you don't mind being recorded, you can of course also raise your hands here in Zoom and ask your questions or make your comments yourselves. But now let me introduce Sayan Day, the author of the book, which is our topic for today. Sayan grew up in Kolkata, West Bengal, and is currently working as a postdoctoral fellow at WITS Center for Diversity Studies at the University of Witwatersrand. He's also a faculty fellow at the Harriet Tubman Institute, York University in Canada. And some of his published books are History and Myth, Post-Colonial Dimensions, published by Vernon Press, 2020, and Myths, Histories and Decolonial Interventions, A Planetary Resistance, published by Routledge last year. And also by Routledge last year is the book of today, Green Academia, Towards Eco-Friendly Education Systems. His areas of research interests are post-colonial studies, decolonial studies, critical race studies, food humanities, and critical diversity literacy. We've also got two discussants today, whom I will introduce after Sayan has given a brief outline of his book. And he will be speaking for about 10 to 15 minutes, followed by interventions by both discussants, after which we will open up the more informal discussion. So please, Sayan, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. First of all, I would like to extend my heartfelt gratitude to Christiane, to EADI Secretariat and the EADI community, and also to the Convivial Thinking Collective, especially to Julia, who is not here right now with us today, but she has played a instrumental role in coordinating and building this space. And also a warm thanks to Vijay and Diana for being there and for agreeing to be the discussants for this particular book launch. And also my warm gratitude to all the people who are present here for the book launch. So what I'm going to do in the course of next 10 to 15 minutes is I'm going to briefly talk about that why did I at all think of writing this monograph. I mean, I have already spoken in bits and pieces, rather I should say written in bits and pieces for the EADI blog a few weeks back, and also for another blog called Doing Sociology in India. But there is always a lot more to say. So the point where I would like to begin is when I started thinking about this particular monograph, the Green Academia, it was actually triggered, all the thoughts were triggered by two wide perspectives. One is very personal and the other is collective. The personal aspect emerges from the fact that, and it goes back to a lot of my sensitive experiences as a child, because when I was 5 years old, I was diagnosed with the challenge of epilepsy and the psychological issue of epilepsy. And from my childhood, what I've experienced widely is that in the name of sympathy, in the name of extra care, I have always been treated, or I used to be treated as someone who is marginalized, who is expected to perform disability, who is not expected to think on its own, who is expected, to follow the norms and conditions as outlined by the societies around us for disabled minds and bodies. And when I started questioning that logically and structurally, obviously I was immediately my ways of thinking, my ways of questioning, my ways of understanding were immediately rejected and demonized, because obviously I was flouting the expected social norms. I was not performing the way the society expected me to perform. And a major challenge that I actually, amongst many challenges, one of the major challenges that I encountered was how I was not expected to ask questions, how I was not expected to think, act, and analyze in my own ways. This was the first point of, the first point of provocation for me to think around a work, a particular whole detailed work that also through the lens of ecological sustainability, through the lens of ecocentric education, widely engages with these questions of how and why we should know to ask questions, why it is important to ask questions, why it is important to interrogate every aspects of education system, every aspects of knowledge systems that exist around us. So that is the first point. And the collective experience is obviously that collective experience emerges from this core personal experience, where as I grew up, I saw that I met a lot of other individuals who have undergone similar sort of experiences and who have encountered different forms of disabilities, psychological disabilities, physical disabilities, and how they have encountered these challenges, and for them how the natural environment has always been a refuge. I mean, for me as well, as a child, when I would feel frustrated with these sort of treatments against me, one of the many refuge would be to sit somewhere in a surrounding, in a natural environment, in I mean completely alone, think around what is happening with me around me, and also just to bring in mental peace with respect to my experiences. And the natural environment in many ways have always been very healing to. So that is here where, with respect to my personal experience, the natural environment comes. And then in the collective space, I have also closely observed that how within the collective space, I have closely observed how the similarly or in other ways, the disabled bodies and minds have always found a refuge in the natural environment. Through closely observing the existential patterns of the natural environment, through not being deceived, through not being left out, through not being forced to perform in specific ways, the natural environment has always been healing for such minds and bodies. And then a major point of departure took place when back in 2019. I mean, obviously, I went to briefly work in Bhutan back in 2018, but after that, it was again in 2019 when I went for a longer period to work in Bhutan, because I have always, on the one side, as I have always been fascinated by the values and the impact of the ecocentric education systems. On the other side, I have always been uh, troubled by the fact that many a times a lot of propositions that have been made with respect to ecocentric education systems necessarily doesn't get applied in our respective spaces. And what I've closely observed is in terms of government policies, if I just take a simple example in the Indian context, I mean, in terms of government policies, in terms of educational policies, we do have a lot of plans and propositions and programs to implement ecocentric education system, to engage with the question of green academia that I talk about in this book. But in terms of application, either we see that there is lack of enthusiasm, there is lack of realization for the necessity of such an application, or even if there is an enthusiasm, there is a complete lack of understanding of how to implement the various policies at the grassroots levels, how to understand the usage of eco-friendly education system, how to understand the application of eco-friendly education system in the practical terms, in terms of curriculums, in terms of pedagogies, in terms of various other forms of educational activities. And my experience in Bhutan was an eye-opener, because it was the first time when I saw how eco-friendly education system has been historically uh, injected within the mainstream educational spaces, have been imbibed within the mainstream educational spaces, and how it is being applied. And the application, how practical it is applied in terms of students not only being taught by the trained teachers, but the students are also being taught by members from the adjacent indigenous communities, who at least visit the schools once a week to tell the students that how knowledge systems are not only restricted within the degrees and the books and the various forms of the so-called mainstream knowledges that we gain from the text, but also it is simultaneously valuable in terms of the context, and how the indigenous communities, despite many of them not undergoing formal education, still are very sensitized and still are very aware of the ecological values and the notions of ecological sustainability in practical terms than as compared to many policymakers. So this was an absolutely eye-opening experience for me, where in the very practical terms, I saw how students on the one side, let's say learning about geographies, cultural studies, histories, or about the soil, about the climate, and then simultaneously, they are also planting trees within their school campus. They're going for animal rearing within the school campus. They're able to, understand the nuances and the scientific methods and the ecologically sustainable methods of dairy farming, and various other perspectives. So that was an eye opener. And then obviously, with which I would like to end my presentation, is also the exposure to various alternative educational institutions in India, about which I have talked a few about in my book. For example, the Barefoot College. Then there are also other institutions towards the southern parts of India and western India, and in other parts of India as well, like the Sarang School in Kerala, where we find that where students are actually taught by keeping the natural environment at the center. Let's say if they are if they're enacting a sort of class performance, if they're enacting any sort of scientific experiments, they're not restricting themselves within specific laboratories. What they're doing is they're performing right open in the natural environment, in sync with the natural environment, and trying to understand how the natural environment teaches us on a daily basis. Obviously, there are a lot of stories to tell. And then I have done a comparison with um, the very green belt movement in Kenya, and also the Maori education system in New Zealand. Now, an obvious question that may come out of this comparison is that why specifically with Kenya and New Zealand? Because obviously, I mean, one thing I can say, I'm from India, so I brought India into the question. I worked in Bhutan, but again, specifically with the Green Belt movement and the Maori education system, because apart from the education systems that I've, the radical education systems that I've talked about in the Indian context and in the Bhutanese context, I was also very much influenced by understanding not just of this book, but widely my engagement with the ecocentric education system was also widely influenced by the Green Belt movement and the Maori education system. And most importantly, how they have very systemically and structurally integrated their ancestral indigenous education systems within the mainstream educational spaces, which is also very important, and about which I also argue in the book that obviously we need tangential radical spaces, but that couldn't be just one solution, because if we let the simultaneous violent capitalistic educational spaces exist, then we don't end up into bringing much of the solutions. So apart from bringing tangential educational spaces, radical educational spaces, it is also important to reconfigure and reform the mainstream capitalistic educational spaces as well, and how it could be possible, some of the possible ways with respect to my experiences I have shared in this particular volume. So I think I have spoken enough. I should stop here, and then we can progress as we go on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sayan. So there will be time to ask questions and to dive deeper into that. Now it's Vijay giving his short reflections on the book from his perspective. Vijay Kolinjivadi is a son, brother, friend, uncle, and cat dad. While currently based in India, he normally resides as a settler in Teotihuacan, also known as Montreal, Canada. He is a postdoctoral researcher at the Institute of Development Policy at the University of Antwerp in Belgium. And he is a social scientist, economist, and ecologist by training, and his research focuses on the promises and perils of the so-called green economy. In particular, he explores the social and ecological impacts that greening solutions to climate change and habitat loss have across different scales. His work focuses on how greening reinforces divisions across class, race, gender, and caste, and seeks to understand ways to build solidarity to repair fragmentations instituted by settler colonialisms and capitalism. So please, Vijay, so go ahead.
Thank you, Christiane, and thank you, Sayan, as well. It's really an honor to be a discussant on this panel. And it was a privilege as well to read, Sayan, your work, Green Academia towards eco-friendly education systems. So my contribution, I think, here is to complement an element of what I think is relevant for the greening of the academy. And I want to build maybe a bit further on what Sayan refers to in the beginning of the book as he calls the ivory tower priests. So commodifying every form of knowledge, what he states as this expropriation of diverse indigenous ecocentric systems of knowledge, and its appropriation as a, quote, exclusionary, egocentric, and universalized system of capitalistic pleasure. And so I think as we as critical scholars and academics should take these claims really seriously. And so to this end, I want to ask some broader political economy questions around academia and education systems in general, and in the process towards, in moving towards what we call the Green Academy. And I want to think through this through the role of political ecology, which is also my own background, and have this kind of understanding as well. So I think basically the contribution offers, it's an important moment, I think, of self-reflection and to build and engage a different kind of academic praxis. So one that we don't prey upon the pain narratives of another. For our own publications and careers, for our own sort of production of knowledge products in a knowledge economy, what is the contemporary and neoliberal, how is the contemporary and neoliberal academy complicit in ecological degradation? I think this is a question that is at the heart of what I see as Green Academy. And I think it comes to the heart of the questions that Sayan is posing about needing to do away and dismantle the kind of capitalistic approach to education systems. But it goes beyond that. What kind of lifestyles and class structures does these forms of education enable and reinforce? Themselves generate specific material and energy demands. How do they transform social space? So, you can think about urban gentrification caused by members of the creative class, largely academics, or not only, but inclusive of university and academia in the academia realm. What ecological demands and forms of cost shifting globally even do these lifestyles encourage? In short, how is class, the issue of class, placed front and center, or conversely not at all, in our understanding of how academia can and should be ecologized? I think this is kind of a core question. And I also think that, Sayan, that you have made clear reference to that, and I will extend it. You say, quoting Sivaramakrishnan, that that the colonial empire, European colonial empires and subsequent modernization project has enabled the systematic extraction of desired economic products. So the quote goes on to talk about destruction of fertile lands, overuse of water resources, and etc. But I would even extend then, it's to this systematic extraction of desired economic products, I would extend as well to academics operating in the neoliberal economy and the knowledge products that they produce, And I want to think a little bit about praxis as well. So this isn't just critique. How do we, through our education systems, learn and then unlearn and relearn? So it's a process of constant, so the theory becomes interwoven with some sort of material change. Now, I think the thing that I want to focus on, there's a lot of points I have, but I will focus now on the underlying questions behind what you raise in the book, and then kind of make a link to political ecology. So how I see it is I think what I'm convinced in the book is how academic learning, how education, how academia can be viewed and understood as an ecological process. So how learning itself is a deeply contextual and embodied personal and collective experience. And since genuine learning means an act of being inquisitive continuously, can we also think of critique as a form of greening in that sense? Because it is, in a way, it is transforming what would otherwise be an intransigent type of education system. And here I relate green or ecologizing knowledge as revealing other relations that have not been squashed through epistemicide and racialized or gendered forms of invisibilization. How does critique raise voice to draw attention to these forms of violence, generating the awareness to encourage abolition, for example? At the same time, how might the very same critique enroll such recognition into the sameness of new knowledge products held by the same actors that uphold a patriarchal capitalist social structure, and often collapsing into powerlessness because of information overload? So we often, when we produce more and more, and there's a greater encouragement to produce, we see this with the artificial intelligence applications and things now, ChatGPT, all of this. It's creating a system where information is now becoming so cheap. What is the threshold at which critical education becomes the thrust into a sense of overload and powerlessness, vis-a-vis critical education as transforming society? And lastly, how might inclusivity through greening, just as inclusivity through critique, create the conditions for a more reinforced status quo? So kind of greenwashing in a way. So rebranding as inclusivity. These are some questions that I have been trying to struggle with. I'm struggling with in this particular contemporary moment that we find ourselves. And there's no easy answer to these questions. And so this last point brings me to political ecology, because there's a profound danger, I feel, that political ecology can become wrapped into the same trap by which it's attempting to break, through it is a field of inquiry that intervenes in social and biophysical processes shaping ecological relations, revealing uneven access to power, etc. So, what happens if in that process we are simply producing more? So the revealing uneven power gets framed as opportunities, for example, to do better, to fine-tune the model forever forwards. How in this way does political ecology and other academics in critical geographies and critical ecological social sciences or human ecology contribute to the transformation of political struggles into product lines? And I also think here about the move towards decolonization, equity, diversity, and inclusion policies, etc. And we have seen this already through some other examples of critique, such as sustainability itself, the concept of buen vivir in Andean regions, how these sometimes become sucked out, left sucked like a shell, and then they're remaining out there, and they leave alienation in their wake, in fact. So, so there's some such questions, and I'll just end by saying here that leading to this idea of praxis. So one of the big takeaways I take from the book is that I think you do really strongly pay attention to praxis in terms of the different examples that you provide, from the Barefoot College to the Sarang School to Vikalp Sangam, how these education systems and schools have maneuvered through the pandemic, making alternative worlds through ecologies that permit life to thrive and ideas to flourish because of actions and relationships. So I think these are initiatives not rooted in critique, in abstraction, but based on resistance, survival, and thriving. So I think those are all things that I think are takeaways. And then the question is, how do we avoid them? How do they confront the power relation that they are embedded within, as I've mentioned? So I'll leave it there, and I'd like to thank you once again for this inspiring contribution, and also to see how education can be done very differently.
Sorry, my unmute button was not working well. So thank you so much. You raised so many questions we could be discussing for ages. But before we dive deeper into those questions, now let me introduce Diana as the second discussant. So Diana Fox is a cultural and applied anthropologist, scholar activist, and documentary film producer. And her work focuses on the Anglophone Caribbean, as well as Nepal and Japan, where she researches issues of gender and sexual diversity, women's social movement, activism for ecological sustainability, women's human rights, and transnational feminisms and activism. She's University Director of the Institute for Gender and Development Studies and the Regional Coordinating Office at the University of the West Indies in Mona, Jamaica. And she's founder and editor of the Journal of International Women's Studies and academic advisor of the United Maroon Indigenous Peoples. One of her films is about a Rastafarian woman who has sparked an environmental movement in the Caribbean. Another one is about LGBTQ activism in Jamaica. So, Diana, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And what interesting presentations came before me. Mine is a little bit different, but the issues intersect with a number of the themes that Sayan, you shared about your background in history, and of course themes from the book, and Vijay in terms of the issues of power dynamics and seeking to implement, well, both of you discussed that, seeking to implement in real ways, not just in symbolic performative ways, these transformative systems. So let me begin by sharing some examples, which is what I'm going to do today, of education systems rooted in Indigenous cultures by way of building on Sayan's call for a green academia. I'm going to do so, moreover, through the lens of the subfield of cultural anthropology known as the anthropology of education, which offers a framework for thinking about education in general. I'm going to be weaving in some quotes from Sayan's book and pointing to ways that the examples I share resonate with his perspectives. Anthropologists understand education in its broadest anthropological sense as the deliberate, systematic, and sustained effort to transmit, evoke, or acquire knowledge, values, attitudes, skills, or sensibilities, as well as any learning that comes from the effort, direct or indirect, intended or unintended. Ethnographers examine how educational institutions relate to other aspects of culture and what it means to be an educated person in various parts of the globe. However, based on the definition I just shared, education is not confined to academic institutions in this anthropological frame, but is regarded as part of the socialization and education and enculturation process. The anthropology of education also asks questions about inequities and injustices and how education systems serve as mechanisms for reproducing stratifications or alternatively teaching ways to interrupt them. For example, my questions, being a feminist scholar, are as follows. How are these stratification systems gendered? How do cultures perceive education differently for girls and boys? How do systems of inequity share access to education, or what is considered education, based on all forms of intersectional identity? And are gendered educations necessarily discriminatory? These are just some of the questions that an anthropology of education asks, intersected with a feminist perspective. Now let me offer some examples of Indigenous education that will illustrate broad examples of education reflecting Indigenous values, beliefs, and practices, but all which recognize the individual as a whole person enmeshed in an ontological system, a world of meaning and relationships. My examples are ethnographic stories, much in the way Sayan begins his book. We are a storytelling species, and it is stories that help make meaning in the world. My first example is the Bamana of Mali, and specifically a caste of men who are carvers making figures of wood, which is what they call them. Figures that we would call statues, we being in the world of in the art world, when we go to museums and see these figures. How do boys become men who are carvers? Boys begin their training when they are very young. Children go into the workshop, which are really spaces outdoors where wood has been collected, and watch their fathers practicing on small pieces of wood themselves. They can then carve their own designs. They have freedom, but that is not what the goal is. The goal is to learn a technique and an aesthetic that form part of their heritage, that includes a series of symbols and signs. They're not creating art for art's sake, a sculpture to admire only for its beauty, but to sustain a tradition. One of those important traditions is carving the important figure of wood called the chawara, an antelope or an ibex. Once carved, these figures are worn in masquerades as headdresses, as part of a whole costume. People dance to drums and women who are singing in a symbolic reproduction of a mythical story of the chawara that taught the Bamana people to till the soil. The carving itself is not produced in isolation of the cultural knowledge of the chawara, but is learned in relation to a rich cultural tradition. The chawara represents the two-pronged plow. When the rainy season begins, the people call the chawara to do a dance that replicates the story and provides strength and wisdom to cultivate the land. More specifically, the chawara is a spirit being, and carving it honors not only the being as an ancestor, but sustains a connection of the people to the forces of life. In the story, under chawara's guidance, humans first learned to cultivate the land and became prosperous and capable farmers, but they became careless and wasteful, and the chawara buried himself in the earth. To honor the chawara's memory, the Bamana created a boli, a power object in which his spirit could reside, and carved headdresses to represent them. The headdresses combine antelope features and other animals that are significant within Bamana culture, such as the earth-digging aardvark. Bamana closely observe animals in their natural habitats to learn from them actions that are also crucial to farming, and therefore Bamana well-being as subsistence farmers. The tapered heads of the sculptures, along with the neck, ears, and horns, are modeled on antelope forms. The lower part of the sculpture refers to the aardvark. Chawara performances give young men the power, as I noted, to plow the fields, encouraging them as they work, and as women sing, they praise their efforts after they have returned to the village when the work is completed. So the ethnographic description of the chawara suggests that the infant on the back of the female is the embodiment of humanity and is a visual treatise on the relationship between the powerful sun, the male, and the gentle, nurturing earth, the female. So here we have different elements of nature and humanity interwoven into a story of creation that is reproduced and performed in order to sustain an order. This sustained order requires a careful education, a training, and an immersion into an entire way of life. The masquerade performances will begin outside the village in the fields and gradually travel to the village center. Women play an integral part, as I've noted, in singing along as the men drum and other men dance in the pair of two tiaras. Sayan has pointed to the role that these stories play in connecting people to non-human life forms and encouraging interdependence. This is crucial, and we see this across Indigenous societies. For example, we see a similar process in the Northwest North American potlatch cultures. The potlatch is a ceremony of ritual exchange of food, blankets, and other gifts, many which have been accumulated in the historically rich space of the Pacific Northwest. However, these potlatches were outlawed in the second half of the 19th century by Canadian and US governments as anti-capitalist practices in their ethic of redistribution, an ethic of equity. For decades, they were practiced quietly in secret, but they have been revived in recent decades as lawsuits have supported Indigenous rights to their culture. There are many kinds of potlatches. They are a ceremony for marriages, funerary rites, seasonal harvests, and the like. And they involve dancers, just as the above example did, wearing masks of totemic ancestors, the lineages of the clans. Certainly the tiara can be considered a kind of totemic ancestors. Totem poles are carvings of these lineages, identifying family and clan relationships rooted in ancient stories. They are powerful examples of enculturation and socialization into interdependent, supportive communities that revive and restore, offering a rich space for education. In 1995, the year I earned my PhD and started teaching, I was looking for ways to engage students in an Anthro of Education unit in a cultural anthropology class. And I came across a dissertation, later turned into a book, by the now deceased Native Alaskan Yup'ik anthropologist, Oscar Kawagli. Kawagli pioneered an approach to curriculum for this Native Alaskan people rooted in what Sayan explains the Barefoot College achieves in its curricular and pedagogical practices that, quote, collapse the binaries between modern Western knowledge systems and Indigenous knowledge systems, theory-based knowledge systems and praxis-based knowledge systems, and text-based knowledge systems and content-based knowledge systems. Kawagli turned his 1995 dissertation into a book, as I stated, called A Yup'ik Worldview, A Pathway to Ecology and Spirit. In the introduction, he explains that his book is an intervention into a curriculum that responds to Yup'ik and all Indigenous peoples who have been subjected to an endless stream of assimilative processes in which they are forced to live in a constructed and psychic world not of their own making or choosing. Kawagli says that little is left in their lives to remind them of their Indigenous culture, nor is there recognition of the Indigenous consciousness and its application of intelligence, ingenuity, creativity, and inventiveness in the making of their world. He thus establishes an Indigenous platform from a case study of Yup'ik Eskimo communities in southwestern Alaska to construct an epistemological framework and pedagogical orientation in which the Western and Yup'ik traditions of knowledge generation and utilization can be addressed, particularly as they pertain to learning and use of scientific knowledge in a traditional Yup'ik environment. He identifies critical elements of the constellation of values and life principles currently operative in a Yup'ik community and explores the extent to which the existing configuration will allow the Yup'ik to reconstruct a world that will empower them with sufficient control over their own lives and give solidarity in their efforts. Again, an example of a collective, interdependent, holistic approach. His work has been enormously influential, and today, both by the influence and by independent efforts, we see this kind of work unfolding in Native American school systems across from North America. Let me sum up with a question and an attempt at a response. How are we going to make this massive shift in understanding that Sayan contends and which I agree is needed? In his words, to quote, navigate ways to weave possibilities of collaborations and intersections between humans and nature to learn, care for, and share knowledges. Our bureaucratic processes in large-scale societies are notoriously slow in making positive change. We can tear things down, eradicate hard-won legislation, destroy much faster than we can build up. Knowing this about ourselves, while we push for large-scale change, we must simultaneously decentralize our efforts, intentionally forging connections with one another to implement these changes. Thus, while working to leverage these changes in academic institutions, we must also adopt the wider lens of anthropology of education by encouraging this worldview of interdependent interconnectedness and its practice everywhere where education is taking place. Human beings possess plasticity and are always learning and adapting. And knowing this, we can be inspired and uplifted into action, viewing ourselves along with others, implementing these changes as part of a global effort. Just this morning, I read an article in the online arts magazine, Hyperallergic, about a new approach to the arts in Europe called Islands of Kinship, a collective manual for sustainable and inclusive art institutions. 6 visual arts organizations across Europe are collaborating on a new project addressing togetherness, fairness, responsibility, and kindness. Quoting from the article, the project's main objective is to create a long-lasting professional platform for joint creation, sharing, and exchange regarding public programming and internal operations. It aims to encourage a permanent change of mindset and the adoption of practices that sound innovative and challenging now, but then in a few years may become vital for institutions to operate fairly, relevantly, and sustainably in a rapidly changing world. One quick example is the curatorial collective and production platform based in Prague. Their group show is called Hay, Straw, and Dump. It opens in Prague next month on March 28th and will feature works from over 20 local international artists reflecting on the consequences of agricultural collectivization in Czechoslovakia before the 1989 revolution and current ecofeminist perspectives. The exhibition focuses on interspecies solidarity, respectful and sustainable relationships, and coexistence, depicting situations in which nature, contaminated by human activity, takes the reins and reestablishes a balance in which humans may or may not participate. Can we change fast enough? I don't know, but to avoid being swallowed by the doom of assumed failure, I urge all of us to look to the myriad of ways transformations are being enacted, even amidst persistent systems of imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy, as the late bell hooks called the systems of interlocking oppression. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Diana, for this positive perspective in the end, positively transformative perspective. Maybe before we continue with the discussion, I can throw in some questions raised by participants here, if that's okay, Sayan. So there is somebody who wants to know your views on how you think the academics could help bringing children and young people closer to the land or indigenous ways of organic farming. So she would like to hear something maybe from your fieldwork, and also how postdocs or early career academics could contribute to this conversation after having realized the huge gap between what academic books publish and how our work could contribute to building relations between children and indigenous communities.
Yes. Thank you so much, Christiane, for reading the question, and thanks a lot for the question, Dikshita. But prior to that, if you can just allow me to respond to Jert's question, because I know Jert is going to leave soon. So that's the reason I would like to respond to his question, and then surely I'll come back to your question, Dikshita. That's a very interesting question. And Jert, thanks a lot for this very important question about if I have engaged with the question of the abolitionist views on academia. And well, I did that right in the introduction, and where I have very particularly with respect to citing, like starting with stories from indigenous narratives and how those stories socio-historically evolved in particular context within specific indigenous communities, and how later on, very unfortunately, and about which Vijay also mentions about the aspect of getting sucked out into the academic space and how they have been misrepresented and misportrayed in the widest Eurocentric academic spaces, and how it has been problematically misstructured and what impacts it have created. And that is the point from where I begin my book. And then I move into the arguments about the various indigenous education systems and how, most importantly, obviously, as Diana also cited many examples, Vijay also talked about, in our previous conversations with Christiane, she also mentioned that, I mean, obviously, there are a lot of indigenous systems. We are all aware of the indigenous knowledge systems, but often we fail to apply them because we are always in a conscious or unconscious state of appropriating them and just implementing them without understanding the contextual values. So thank you so much for this question, Gert. And yes, I also very much, actually what I try to do in terms of engaging with the concept of academia, and since you also raised this very important aspect of both the Western and the non-Western knowledge systems, widely what I believe, and again, it is my perspective, no one has to agree with that, is decolonization is not always about de-Westernization. I mean, decolonization is not that simple concept where we always call for de-Europeanization or de-Westernization. It's very multi-layered, it's very complex, and it is important for us to try to understand those complex nuances when we engage with the question of decolonizing academia. And that is what I centrally argue very specifically in my chapter on science and technology studies. I mean, it sounds great when we call for, when we speak against the technological values, it sounds very radical and it's great. But when it comes to the question of practical application, it appears like a distant thought. So there are certain things that we derive pleasure, that we derive positive values out of it, which has emerged in the West. But what is important precisely, obviously it's a long discussion, but to be precise, what is precisely important is to consistently resist against its negative implications, consistently resist against its attitude of ownership or dictatorship, which is very important. So when I engage with the question of Western education system as well as non-Western education system, I try to engage in a practical way as possible to build forth this argument that let us not just, when we engage with these concepts, when we engage with these topics, let us not just be very generalized and just add the prefix D with every word and try to prevent everything, because practically it's not possible. A lot of this resistance are reciprocated in nature. A lot of these resistances are relational in nature. And I will also further argue to make it appear more complex to say that the resistances and the relationalities, they exist simultaneously. So it is very difficult at times just to, take in something at the cost of something else. I don't know if it has answered your question. I know it's a wide sort of question. Thank you. And yes, now I'll move to Dikshita. Thank you so much, Dikshita, for this question. And I think it's a very practical question. The question that I have asked myself so many times while writing this book, after writing this book, and I keep asking myself, what is important is to first change our attitude and approach with this notion that academics will not bring the children or the young people closer to the lands and the organic farming, because the indigenous communities, the children, the elders, whosoever is there, they're born close to the land. They're born close to nature. They learn with and from nature. their everyday forms of existence are centered on nature. So the moment we actually say, or the moment we think in this line, that as, let's say, academics, it is our responsibility to bring them close to the line, close to the land, it is at that very moment, consciously or unconsciously, we perform a sort of catastrophe of knowledge production, where we by default positionalize ourselves in that central space, that it is our responsibility, it is our duty to bring them to the land, close to the land. So my point is, first of all, they are already close to the land. Rather, on the contrary, it is the responsibility of us academics to go close to the land and learn with them. So instead of uprooting and rerouting them, especially of what Vijay widely talks about, which I will like to, in terms of class structures and social relationships, what Vijay widely talks about, also very much syncs with this point, Dikshita, that you are raising, is the way we approach the knowledge spaces of the natural environment, the way we approach the indigenous knowledge systems is very important. It is our responsibility, if we are emerging from that space, it is our responsibility to preserve that space. And if we are not emerging from those indigenous spaces, it is our responsibility to respectfully walk into the space and learn with them, rather than performing those colonial exercises of appropriation and expropriation. So I think first is self-reflection and change in our respective attitudes of thinking, of our approach towards indigenous lands, indigenous seeds, organic farming. And the next part is in connection to that, what you share about to what extent this academic books actually contributes practically to these spaces. I think this is a fantastic question. It does, to a certain extent, I must be honest. Because if you talk about my personal understanding with respect to the book Green Academia, I'm still trying to find spaces where I can translate, I can find suitable translators to translate this book in various local languages in India. Now, and also translators translate the work into languages that caters to the communities that I have talked about in my book. Now, it is an uphill task. Obviously, I know I am a Bengali, I know the Bengali language. So what I have already done is recently I published a Bengali book, which was released just at the beginning of this month, which widely talks about this particular work, Green Academia, and then is an extension of the work, Green Academia. So obviously, I hope that it will reach people who are not familiar with the English language and who can have access to, and those who are aware of the Bengali language and have access to this particular book. But I think one important way is to make this work available in the local languages in terms of translation. For instance, like a lot of the arguments in the Green Academia book stems from the green education system of Bhutan. And there is a manifesto called the Green School Manifesto, now, which emerged in Bhutan, obviously, in their local language, in the local national language. It's called the Dzongkha language. And then it was translated into English consequently. And now this book has already been translated in 20 to 25 international and local languages across the world. So now this sort of translation is making this book easily available to communities who are not familiar with the English language. So I think, it partially helps. But I think translation plays an important role. It has its own set of politics. That's a different sort of discussion on its own. But translation could be one way of making these works available to the people. There could be many other creative ways. For instance, if I have access to these communities personally, if I can physically be present with these communities, I can tell them what I have written with respect to learning with them in the book. And it is not learning from them. It is about learning from them, but it is not about extracting data and information from them and then running away and vanishing. but it is also about going back to the communities. Even if translation is not an immediate possibility, it is at least telling them, sharing with them, and getting their feedback, getting their critique about the work, and then think further about the development of the work in various other ways in the present and in the future. So this is another, for instance, I have already done a Zoom sort of, it was not a book release, but a Zoom sort of engagement with the community members in Bhutan who assisted me, who taught me about their cultures, their traditional values and knowledge systems. Unfortunately, I have to do a Zoom call because of all these physical restrictions and many other issues. But it was nice to see them and get their feedback. Obviously, they all did not know the English language. They were speaking in Dzongkha. It was translated by somebody else to me. I was responding in the same way. But at least, obviously, there were a lot of barriers. But at the same time, I can say that at least I could reach close to the community as closely as possible in such sort of circumstances. So this would be a possible way. Obviously, there are many other possible ways, but these aspects could be the beginning point of the indulgence.
So yes, thank you for a really, really detailed answer. So maybe before we come to Anna's question, Diana, would you like to share your comment here in public with us?
Sure, happy to do so. I was responding to the complexities of engaging with Indigenous communities, and you know, as an anthropologist who has engaged, you know, for decades with Indigenous communities, the process is fraught, and also requires a deep building of rapport, of trust, and so I'm sort of imagining, as Sayan was talking, you know, groups of school children coming to visit the Bamana community and looking at, you know, the carvers sitting around in a circle and little boys making their carvings, and thinking about how complex, how it would not be immediately available to them that this little carving is tied to a whole world view, a whole set of stories, and an orientation of people to other living beings, and to their cosmological construction. So I think that the question needs to be really thought out carefully in each context, with each different group of people, based on local norms and value systems and praxis. There need to be various kinds of engagements, and also, you know, Indigenous peoples can't simply be regarded, as Sayan was saying, as a sort of a teaching us, right, who are not from those communities, without any kind of remuneration, or, you know, and we just drop by. But there's a rich anthropological literature, you know, decolonial anthropological literature that challenges historical ways of engaging with such communities, and maps out ethical ways that are not in any way simplistic or homogeneous. So I think just thinking context, specificity, ethics, rapport building, all those things need to be taken into account.
Yes, definitely. So now all the examples that have been brought up here, of course, as well as in the book, are from the global South, which is of course utterly important. But I mean, the whole capitalistic and proprietary knowledge realm came from the global North. So that leads us to the question of Anna: how would the approach to incorporate indigenous knowledges into education look like in Europe? Because there are no indigenous groups left. So they cannot just simply be transformed from other cultures. So how to deal with the whole thing of greening academia and education in Europe?
Thank you so much, Anna, for this question. Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, obviously, to be very honest, I'm not in a position to very specifically comment about the indigenous history of the indigenous knowledge spaces, particularly in Europe. But if I take into account this aspect of the non-existence of indigenous communities in Europe, what I personally believe is that the indigenous communities, even if they don't exist very prominently in the contemporary spaces, but the remnants of the knowledge systems are bound to exist, because knowledge systems usually travel from one generation to another, and it is not just about remaining restricted within the indigenous communities, but through multiple levels of interactions and exchanges that have once taken place from time to time, has actually led to the movement of those knowledge systems from within those respective communities to outside as well. So oral scholarships, in terms of written scholarships, even if the fragments of those knowledge systems exist, it is important to identify them. It is important to evaluate the ecological values of those knowledge systems, and try to figure out how they are, or how they could be put into praxis within the mainstream education systems in the contemporary era. So I think this could be one way of doing it, because there has to have some fragments. And also, even if the communities do not exist very prominently, at least their lineages, family lineages may exist, and who still bears the knowledge systems, even in bits and pieces. It is important to get access to those spaces, and in collaboration with those individuals, in collaboration with those communities, there could be a possibility of bringing of sort of developing an archive of those fragments, and then try to see how they could be utilized in the contemporary educational spaces.
Just to add on that, of course, in the chat, there were comments saying that there are, in fact, indigenous peoples available in Europe. For example, the Sami people who live in Finland, Sweden, Norway, and parts of Russia. Of course, there are still indigenous people in Europe, maybe not in Central Europe. So
Can I
would
add to that really quickly, just to clear up any misunderstandings? I mean, there are lots of ways to think of indigeneity, and the Roma people can also be considered indigenous. In Ireland, there are still Celtic speakers who practice Celtic, various, ancient religious practices. Part of the belief that there are no indigenous peoples belongs to the invisibilizing of indigeneity, and that's part of the decolonizing process to challenge that.
Yes, definitely. So I think Vijay had very many perspectives and interesting thoughts to raise. So that's why I would like to give the floor now to Vijay to make a few comments or raise questions.
Yes, thanks. Just to follow up on the comment, I want to follow up on two things, and then I'll come back to what I was going to contribute further. But so I just posted a link to the Lost Forest Gardens of Europe. So this is a kind of a project that had been documenting past practices by peasants and others who have been across the continent, whose practices have been lost over the centuries. And there's a concerted effort to try to reestablish them. Many of them are deeply based on principles, ecological principles and things. So the idea of indigeneity in Europe, as Diana was saying, is also very can be understood in different ways. I also wanted to go back now to a comment that Diana also made earlier, and is also related to one of the comments that was made about indigenous, about coming in from the outside and things like that. I am just, as a current issue that I'm struggling with the project that I'm involved in, I'm trying to understand a situation where there is a not communicable, so this is a purely isolated indigenous community that is now under complete threat, so they could be lost with the development project that is coming in place. So the only people who will respond, who can speak on their behalf, are anthropologists. And then that raises a whole many sorts of questions, how can we, what do you do in a situation so thinking about education, thinking about how to educate collectively and then act upon that collectively. How can we act by speaking on behalf of a voice that we cannot possibly, we don't even have enough information to know about how worldviews and the ontological way of being is in fact imbued in products that we can see, or not products, but actual relations that we can indeed view. We don't even know that. So, and should we know that? The question is, should we know? Do we have to know in order to be able to? So that's one thing. Then I wanted to ask a question to refer back to my intervention. This is to Sayan. So I have been following the STS kind of developments in India, and I'm seeing how there's efforts towards trying to push for within the technology institutes, the ITTs and things like the IITs, like how to push towards thinking about technology in multiple ways and the power relations associated with technology. All of these things are deeply kind of pushing the edge, and there's a sociological dimension to them. But at the end of the day, the way that the students, everything becomes about branding. Ultimately, even degrees are brands, it doesn't matter what you learned. It doesn't even matter about the education you have. It doesn't even matter what contributions you have to make. It simply is about, where did you land? What do you walk away with? And this goes back to this question of how this becomes a class project, how education can become a class project. And then what happens when the agency of the students who have learned so much, that becomes a psychological form of torture for them, because they know they will not be able to use that information in any viable way. And in fact, they will lose it. And then they'll be trapped either in this space where they are hanging onto the academy because they're nostalgic for the ability to learn these things and to think creatively without being able to act upon them, or they are forced to let it go and forced to follow into in the case of the IITs, follow into the IT line and let everything go, let go purely the engineering route, despite the fact that their education system has opened up the possibility of thinking differently. So that's, yeah, sorry, there were three things that I mentioned there, but there's that was the final contribution, or the last thing I wanted to add.
Yes, sorry.
Sorry, I don't know whether Diana, if you had a thought on comment that I made, or if Sayan, you also did, or anyone else.
Let's let Sayan respond, and then I can jump in if I have something else to add afterwards.
I mean, with the first question that you asked in terms of the language, I think it's honestly, it's very difficult to give an immediate response. Like, it's such a sort of complex situation where there is a linguistic barrier. Obviously, I am not an anthropologist in per se, like particularly anthropologist. So maybe obviously Diana would be in a much better space to engage with this particular question in terms of this practical barrier. But what would I have been done? I would have went in to ask a few more questions to my own self in order to counter this particular question. Is the first is then how do I communicate with the community in terms of language? There has to be some sort of translator talking to us. Now, translation itself is so politically constructed. If we are not aware of both the languages, then it becomes very challenging for us to understand if the translation is being done in a correct way, or there are some loose ends into the translation which are being deliberately created to hide certain perspectives and ideas. So which is in itself a complex task. So probably, you know, like Vijay, your first question is actually, instead of a concrete answer, it is leading me to a multiple set of questions further. Like in such a scenario, if I would have been in your place, what could I have done the best way of doing? So, I mean, honestly, immediately, I don't have a very structured response apart from, you know, asking these further questions, and maybe a response to these questions may, you know, kind of connect to a response to your first question. But in terms of the, excuse me, but in terms of the second question that you put forth in terms of STS, IITs, and then you bring in a lot of intersectional dimensions like power relations, branding, class projects, and they're all just very interrelated to each other. And I think what you point out, Vijay, in terms of IIT is very, very crucial, and also is very alarming at the same time, because usually, in fact, in one of our last informal conversations also, I was sharing that how the whole curricular structure in the IITs in India in terms of humanities and social sciences is just a replication or a forced replication of the paradigm or the structure that is followed for science and technology and engineering, and how that one size fits all space is being created and every other discipline is being forced to fall into that space. And it is this basic problematic attitude that actually leads to these other sorts of challenges, like branding, in terms of degree branding, in terms of, you know, generating projects on STS and science and technology studies. But sadly, on a lot of occasions, they are mostly appropriative in nature. Even when they are indulging communities, even when they are planning to, you know, go into communities, they always have this attitude, or if not always, and a lot of times they have this attitude of empowering the community rather than empowering themselves about the community knowledges, or making it a sort of fair exchange. That, okay, whatever you know, you share with us, whatever we know, we share with you. And we try to build a collaborative space, which often happens with these STS projects. And that's why, I mean, it ends up to be a celebratory project with funds and publications and, you know, a lot of other projects that emerge out of it. But ultimately, when we think about the practical impact, the practical implication, if any practical social transformation has been brought out by these projects, unfortunately, on a lot of occasions, the answer is no. And so this is where, and why do we fail widely to tap in with these particular parameters of class structures? Why do we often fail to identify the branding intentions that underlie these projects? Is because of our problematic approach towards these spaces, is where we are always ready to empower others, but we are least bothered about self-empowerment, or failing to understand that empowerment, when we engage with the indigenous communities and in general community works, empowerment, understanding, knowledge gaining and sharing is a reciprocative process. It's not a sort of unidirectional process where only I kind of self-celebrate as an all-knowing entity and sit at the center and dispense sort of doctrines to other people, which is very problematic. And a lot of these IIT projects in terms of STS, and that is why in the chapter when I talk, and also you rightly mentioned that political ecology could be a very appropriative space. It's not that we have the term, you know, there, it means that it is a sort of celebratory space. It can be a very problematic appropriative space. And this is why, I mean, I also talk about very specifically and categorically in that particular chapter that why political ecology and STS should be adopted in specific contextual ways, not just adopting it as being, because these paradigms have once again evolved somewhere in the Eurocentric space. And we have to be very particular, we have to be very aware of the fact that we don't end up into that same trap of sort of copying their ideas and knowledges and force fitting within our respective contexts. It is important to value our respective contexts. Maybe, I don't know, Vijay, if it closely answers your question.
I can jump in to add to that. And yeah, I mean, I think that obviously context, is crucial, but when we're in a situation like you described, Vijay, where there's a relatively isolated, and I'll tell you why in a second I say relatively, culture group, indigenous group that is under threat, my immediate question would be how much of a threat, and how soon is the threat going to materialize? That question is important because it identifies, the kind of methodology that we would harness to engage with this group of people. While you were talking, my first thought went to Gayatri Spivak's article, Can the Subaltern Speak? And I thought about Muhammad Bouazizi, who was the street vendor who self-immolated right before the Tunisian revolution. Is the only way of speaking for someone who could not raise his voice to protest his conditions, to self-immolate. Buddhist monks, some Buddhist monks have done the same. And destruction should not be allowed to happen in that sense. So there, and as Sayan mentioned and writes in his book and said, we have to think about ways in which there can be engagement across different modes of knowing and being. So to that, I would say that typically most languages, this comes from linguistic anthropology, fall into language families. So depending on where this group is located, there are probably related languages and people who might be able to communicate on some level. I would also, it's also, not knowing anything about this example, this situation, people must be aware on some level that they're threatened. Incursions into their land and whether it's logging or whatever it might be that is happening. So there are many ways to communicate, whether it's trying to understand related possible language families and bring interpreters from there to describe, the situation that's happening, and even to offer some examples through that process. Although again, it depends on the speed in which this that may happen, that other indigenous groups have engaged in. So the Kayapo, for example, a group living in the rainforest in the Amazon, were faced with an extractive gold mine, which was built by the Brazilian. It was created by the Brazilian government. But the Kayapos sent some of their young people to law school so that they could then negotiate to figure out a way to intervene on a process that would have destroyed their forest, and to find a way to come to some sort of partnership. It was a very long process. They also went to the legislative arenas and staged a performance wearing their war regalia. They blocked an airstrip, also wearing their war regalia and doing their traditional dances. There is a host of material on the forms of resistance. We have the water guardians, that were a few years ago blocking the pipeline, in South Dakota. So I think that first of all, to make any specific recommendations, I would have to know the context of everything. But I think we are all human beings, and cultures are not fully bounded, impermeable entities. This is known as the sort of billiard ball theory of culture. They are permeable and emergent and unfolding and contradictory, so that there are ways to seek entry and that are based on some shared values. Protecting the environment is one shared value. Protecting, their way of life is a shared value. Finding ways to communicate that and the impending threat, and then collaboratively developing a strategy, I think would be the way that I would go about it. Because the alternative, self-immolation or destruction, is not acceptable. But just would require further research in order to understand all these features that I've just outlined.
Yeah, I think it's, as you said in the beginning, Diana, it's about many people in many places taking transformative action from their own environments. So there is of course, no one-fits-all solution. I would like, in the end, looking at the time that we are almost coming to a close, I would like to get back to one last question which came here from the audience. There's Tina asking, from the northern context, where it's sometimes in academia where indigenous knowledge from the south is appropriated. So she would like to know examples from India, where there's also an unfair appropriation of indigenous knowledges and practices, like what has happened in the north. So would you have anything to share there?
Sure. Thank you so much, Tina, for this question. And I'm also glad you are here because you have been one of my endorsers for the book. So it's glad to have you here because you've also read the book so deeply. I think what you point out is in terms of India, I mean, there has been a whole history right from the time of colonization, even prior to the time of European colonization, where indigenous knowledges and practices have undergone multiple levels of appropriation. And it also vitally connects to what Vijay was arguing about the question of branding, where in order to present to the world that you see how much we are conscious about the indigenous knowledge values, from time to time, different forms of dance festivals, music festivals, food festivals are being organized, but which are nothing more than a very shoddy way of displaying the indigenous communities and objects to the outside world, and which is very problematic. It is a sort of, if you see the way they are being organized, the typical audiences for whom they are organized, and the sort of audiences that visit, the way they visit and approach the various indigenous objects and the relics in those spaces, is extremely disturbing and problematic in nature. And they're just being presented as objects of display, as once being done by the European colonizers in terms of black bodies, in terms of the minds and the intellects and the bodies from the global south. So obviously it's there, and it happens in a very systematic way. I mean, in terms of, let's say, let's take another example, right? In terms, since you mentioned the question of neoliberal universities as well, where in terms of curriculums, in terms of pedagogies, I mean, just to show to the people that we are conscious about it, you have a, let's say in English literature, you have a specific module like tribal literatures in translation. But how many of us are in a position or have this consciousness to question this whole notion of tribal, and how the tribalization of communities has itself been a very violent task, has itself been a very violent process? But we hardly do that. We have tribal literatures in translation, we read them, we celebrate them, and we try to tell to the world, you see how much we are conscious about. But within that, you also have politics. Whose literatures you are including, whose literatures you are not including, what sort of readings are included, what sort of discussions are being done inside the classrooms, and what sort of discussions are systematically ignored. They're all being structured and underlined with political propagandas, cultural propagandas, racial propagandas, gendered propagandas, and several other sorts of ideologies and challenges. So obviously and there are various other examples, Tina, to say the least. But one thing, I mean, as I totally agree with you. I mean, the neoliberal universities are quite a complex space to bring in these transformations. But I personally always believe that somewhere, somewhat, we have to invade these problematic spaces and try to bring the transformations, because what makes me afraid is if we leave out these spaces untouched and unturned, and if we just think of simultaneous alternate spaces, obviously that is a good solution. But let us also remind ourselves that these problematic spaces continue to exist. And till the point they continue to exist, they won't allow these simultaneous radical spaces to survive. Somewhere, somewhat, they will again, come together to dismantle these radical spaces. So this is very unsettling. It's very problematic. It comes up with innumerable challenges. On a lot of occasions, our jobs are threatened, our lives are threatened. I totally take into account all these perspectives. But still, somewhere, somewhat, my question is, do we have an option? I don't think so. Instead of going into and invading these spaces and consistently navigate, build networks, planetary networks into our respective spaces, and keep on challenging and unsettling and invading the spaces, that would be my question to end with.
Yeah, I think that was really a very good concluding remark, and a task for all of us ahead to be active in our respective spaces and do as much as we can to transform them to the biggest extent possible. So thank you all very much for coming, for being here, for Sayan, for you to share your thoughts about your book, and for Vijay and Diana to bring in your perspectives, and for everybody else for attending. So thank you so much, and yeah, hope to see you once again in some other space. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, all of you, and thank you, Diana, Vijay, Kristen, and all of you, Tina, Dikshita, Julia, and all the rest, Anna, and I can see someone, but the name is still showing Kristen. So thank you, all of you, for your fantastic interventions, the arguments, and such fascinating questions and reflections. Thanks a lot once again.